In 2023, student loan debt in the United States crossed $1.9 trillion. That number is so large it has stopped feeling real to most people, which is exactly the problem. $1.9 trillion. That is more than the entire GDP of Canada. I lived mostly by people who were told at age 17 or 18 that this was just the cost of doing business, that this was how you build a life, that the alternative was unthinkable. Meanwhile, the same year, the median starting salary for a 4-year college graduate was around $58,000 a year before taxes, before rent, before the loan repayments that at standard rates consume somewhere between $400 and $900 a month for the next decade. And those are the people who graduated. About 40% of students who enroll in 4-year programs in the United States do not finish within 6 years. They get the debt. They do not get the credential. The system takes their money and gives them nothing they can use, and then it moves on to the next batch. Here is the part that should bother you. None of this is new information. Everyone knows this. It has been in the news every year since at least 2012. People know the debt numbers. They know the salary numbers. They know the dropout statistics. And for a long time, they kept going anyway because the alternative felt riskier than the known problem. That is changing, and not slowly. The generational shift happening right now in how people think about education credentials and the relationship between learning and earning is one of the most structurally significant economic realignments in the last 50 years. It is not a trend. It is not a vibe. It is a system under pressure finally cracking at every seam simultaneously. So here is my question before we start. If you knew at 17 that you were about to sign a contract committing you to 6 figures of debt in exchange for a 50-50th shot at a job that might not require what you just spent 4 years learning, would you have signed it? And more importantly, why did so many people say yes? That is what we are actually going to talk about. We are going to explain how the education credentialing system works, why the economics of it have quietly collapsed, and why it is getting genuinely weird. Not weird like interesting cultural moment weird. Weird like the incentive structure has fully inverted and almost nobody is saying it out loud weird. The model I want you to hold in your head for this entire video is a conveyor belt. Specifically, a factory conveyor belt from the mid-20th century. You walk in one end as a raw material. You move through a series of standardized processes and you come out the other end as a finished product that a specific type of buyer is waiting to purchase. The buyer is corporate employers. The product is credentialed semi-inchangeable workers. The factory is the university system. That conveyor belt was built for a specific economic era. It worked beautifully for that era. And we are now living in the moment where the buyers have started to change what they want. The factory has not updated its processes and the raw materials, which is to say actual humans with actual lives are starting to look at the belt, look at the exit door and make a different calculation. Keep that image in your head. We are going to come back to it a lot. Let me start with the economics because that is where the crack is most visible. There is a concept in finance called return on investment. You spend $1, you get back some multiple of $1 over time, and the ratio between those two things determines whether the investment was worth making. This is not a controversial concept. It is how every rational capital allocation decision gets made. For a long time, the return on investment for a 4-year college degree was genuinely strong. Studies from the 1990s and early 2000s showed that college graduates earned on a lifetime basis somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million more than high school graduates. That premium was called the college wage premium, and it was real and it was large and it justified the cost of attendance even as costs started rising. Here is what people stopped checking. The premium was real, but the cost was also rising, and those two things were not moving at the same speed. From 1980 to 2024, the average cost of a 4-year college education in the United States increased by over 1,200% after adjusting for inflation. Inflation during that same period was roughly 350%. Meaning the cost of college grew at roughly 3.5 times the rate of general inflation sustained for 4 decades. Meanwhile, the college wage premium started to compress, not disappear, compress because more people had degrees. When a credential becomes universal, it stops being a differentiator. It becomes a flaw. A 40-year-old manager in 2005 who had a bachelor's degree was probably one of a smaller pool of candidates. A 22-year-old job applicant in 2025 is competing against thousands of people with identical credentials for the same position. The credential stopped being the moat. It became the admission ticket just to be considered, which is a completely different economic function. So, you have costs rising at 3.5 times inflation. You have the wage premium compressing as degree saturation increases. And you have a third variable that almost nobody talked about for years, which is the risk profile. If you invest in a stock and it goes down, you lost money, but you retain some flexibility. You can sell, you can hold, you can adjust. If you take on student loans to get a degree and a degree does not produce the expected return, you are stuck. Federal student loans in the United States are famously non-dischargeable in bankruptcy in most circumstances. That was changed from standard bankruptcy law in 2005. What that means in practice is that student debt is structurally different from almost every other form of consumer debt. It follows you. You cannot restructure it through normal financial mechanisms. The risk is not just the cost. The risk is the permanence of the cost. So you have rising prices, compressing returns, and structurally non-dischargeable debt. And the system kept telling people it was a safe investment. That is not a small mistake. That is a fundamental misrepresentation of the risk profile of a financial product sold to teenagers. Now, here is the first layer that most people miss when they talk about this. They frame the problem as universities being greedy. They frame it as administrators being overpaid. They frame it as a cultural failure where everyone got caught up in the prestige of college without thinking about the numbers. Those things are all somewhat true, but they are not why the system is built the way it is. The system is built the way it is because of how it gets paid. Think about this. What is the one thing that a university needs more than anything else to survive as an institution? Students, more specifically, enrolled students. Because enrolled students bring tuition revenue. And more importantly, in recent decades, enrolled students bring financial aid dollars, which are ultimately backed by the federal government. The more students enroll, the more money flows into the institution, regardless of what happens to those students after they leave. A university does not get paid more if its graduates earn more. It does not get penalized if its graduates default on their loans. Until very recently, there was essentially no financial feedback loop between student outcomes and institutional revenue. The incentive was enrollment, not outcomes. And if your incentive is enrollment, you are going to optimize for everything that increases enrollment, which is marketing, brand prestige, campus amenities, athletic programs, and ranking systems that measure inputs, not outputs. This is not a criticism of individual university administrators or professors. Most of them are intelligent people doing reasonable things given the incentives in front of them. This is a criticism of the incentive structure itself, which was designed by legislation and funding mechanisms over decades and which created a factory that optimizes for processing students through not for producing useful outcomes. The conveyor belt does not care if you land a job. The conveyor belt cares that you got on the belt and paid the toll. And for a long time enough people came out the other end doing okay that nobody questioned the belt itself. Now, let me talk about what has actually changed, because the economics I just described have been getting worse for at least 15 years. What flipped something more fundamental is what happened to information access. Think about what a university degree was actually selling in 1990 or 2000. It was partly selling credentials, yes, but it was also selling access to information, access to expertise, access to networks, and a structured environment in which to develop competence over 4 years. In 2000, if you wanted to learn programming, you needed a computer science program or you needed to know people who knew things. If you wanted to learn finance, you needed a finance degree or you needed a very unusual set of circumstances to teach yourself. The information was not freely available. The expertise was gated. The institutional access was worth something real. Between roughly 2012 and 2020, that changed almost completely. And not gradually, rapidly, every major technical skill set became learnable for free or near free through YouTube, through MOOCs, through open source documentation, through online communities that were genuinely more current and more applied than most university curricula. A kid in 2024 who wants to learn software development can access for free better structured material than was being taught in most mid-tier university programs at any point in the previous decade. Not slightly better, substantially better, because the free material is created by practitioners. It gets updated when technology changes and is ruthlessly optimized for comprehension because its creators only get paid when people actually learn from it. The university curriculum gets updated when the department votes to update it, which happens on a multi-year cycle and which requires navigating academic politics that have nothing to do with what the job market actually wants. This is not a marginal gap in a field like machine learning or web development or digital marketing or data analysis. The gap between what is taught in most university programs and what is actually used in industry has become wide enough to drive a cargo ship through. And GenZ noticed, not collectively, not through some organized movement, but individually in the specific and personal way that 18-year-olds notice when a system that is supposed to serve them is actually using them as inputs for its own perpetuation. Here is a number I want you to sit with. In 2019, around 69% of high school graduates in the United States enrolled in college the following fall. By 2024, that number had dropped to around 62%. 7 percentage points in 5 years. That sounds small until you realize that for 40 years prior to that, that number had been essentially flat or rising. A sustained generational trend reversing in 5 years is not a blip. It is a structural shift. And it is not happening because young people are getting lazier or less ambitious. It is happening because a specific subset of young people, the most analytically inclined, the most opportunity-seeking, the most plugged into alternative information sources, have run the numbers and decided the conveyor belt is not worth the toll. If you think the most ambitious people opting out of a system weakens the system marginally, you are thinking about it wrong. A system's legitimacy depends partly on the quality of the people choosing it. When the quality of the average entrant on the conveyor belt declines because the people who have optioned out are the people most capable of succeeding without it, the value of the credential produced by that system also declines. It is a self-reinforcing loop. The belt produces less valuable outputs. The most capable people are less likely to choose the belt. The belt produces even less valuable outputs. This is not a prediction. This is a dynamic that is already underway. Now let me talk about the demand side, because the conversation about college usually focuses on students, on what they are choosing and what they are opting into, but the employers, the buyers on the other end of the conveyor belt, have been doing something quietly for about 8 years that fundamentally changes the math. Starting around 2017 and accelerating sharply through 2020 and beyond, a significant and growing number of major employers began removing the 4-year degree requirement from job postings. IBM did it. Apple did it. Google did it. Delta Airlines, Bank of America, Accenture, General Motors. By 2023, something like half of all job postings from companies in the Fortune 500 no longer listed a 4-year degree as a requirement. Now, some of this is PR. Some companies announce degree-free hiring policies and then their actual hiring practices lag behind their stated policies. That is real and worth acknowledging. But the underlying reason they are doing it is not goodwill. The underlying reason is that the credentials stopped predicting performance well enough to justify filtering on it. When a degree stopped being a reliable signal of relevant competence, it became an expensive filter that was screening out good candidates who had built skills through non-traditional paths. And in a labor market that became increasingly tight and increasingly technical, that filter was costing employers real money. When the buyer starts changing what they purchase, the factory has a problem. The conveyor belt was built because the buyers wanted a specific product. If the buyers increasingly want a different product, the belt is no longer serving anyone except itself. This is where it starts getting genuinely weird. If you go to most universities right now and ask them what the value proposition of their institution is, they will tell you some version of the following. They will talk about lifelong earning premiums. They will talk about critical thinking skills. They will talk about social development, about learning to live with people different from you, about exposure to diverse ideas. They will talk about the college experience. And here's the thing, some of those things are real. Critical thinking, genuine intellectual exposure, learning to navigate complex social environments. These are not nothing. These are legitimately valuable human experiences. But none of them require $1.9 trillion in aggregate debt to produce. None of them require a system where the average price of 4 years has increased at 3.5 times the rate of inflation for 40 consecutive years. The experience is real. The cost is a construction. And those two things have decoupled. What is happening right now, and this is the part that feels genuinely historical when you step back from it, is that for the first time in about a century there is a credible alternative infrastructure developing in parallel. Not a replacement for every university function. Not something that works for every person in every field, but a functional alternative system of skill building, network formation, credential signaling, and economic participation that does not require the belt. And that alternative system is being built and validated in real time by people who are 22 years old and making 6 figures without a degree, and whose existence is now visible to every 17-year-old with a phone. That visibility is new. That is the variable that nobody modeled correctly. In 2000, if you dropped out of college and built something, almost nobody outside your immediate circle knew about it until you were already successful enough to be written about. The feedback loop was long and slow. The dropout success story existed, but it was invisible to the next generation at the moment of decision. Now it is the opposite. The kid who built a software product at 19 and is making $20,000 a month is posting about it. Not bragging necessarily, just existing in public. And every 17-year-old who is trying to figure out whether to take on $80,000 in debt to get a degree in communications is watching that exist in real time. The alternative path is now legible before you have committed to the traditional one. This changes the decision calculus at the individual level in a way that is hard to overstate. If you want to subscribe, this is probably the part of the video where that becomes a rational decision. I do not make content constantly, but when I do, it is specifically for people who want to understand how systems work and how to position themselves inside those systems. If that is what you are here for, hitting subscribe costs you nothing, and it means you are in the loop when the next thing comes out. Now, let me tell you about the third layer of this, which is the part that feels darkest if you think about it carefully. Do universities? No, not all of them. Not the individual professors and advisors and staff members who genuinely care about students, but institutionally at the level of boards and administrators and enrollment strategy teams, many universities are aware that their value proposition is weakening. And their response to that awareness has not been to fix the value proposition. Their response has been to accelerate enrollment through marketing. This is the incentive structure playing itself out perfectly. You have an institution whose revenue depends on enrollment. You have a weakening product that is generating more student debt and fewer outcomes. What do you do if your incentive is survival of the institution? You invest in recruitment, in marketing, in making the decision feel inevitable and safe and prestigious. You make the belt look more appealing as its output quality declines. You do not fix the belt because fixing the belt costs money and time and requires admitting the belt was broken. I am going to tell you about Marcus. Marcus is not a real person, but he is a composite of a pattern I have watched play out multiple times. Marcus is from a mid-sized city, first-generation college student. His family does not have money, but they are not destitute either. He is smart. He is motivated. He genuinely wants to build something for himself. His high school counselor tells him that college is the path. His parents believe college is the path because when they were growing up, college was actually the path for people with limited resources to move into the middle class. That was true. It was genuinely true for decades. Marcus applies to a handful of schools. He gets into a regional university with a decent reputation. The financial aid package looks generous until you read the fine print and realize that 40% of it is loans, not grants. His total cost over 4 years is going to be around $92,000. He is 17 years old and he signs. He picks business administration because it feels broad and employable. In his sophomore year, he starts realizing that most of his courses are teaching him frameworks that feel abstract and disconnected from anything he can actually see working in the world. He starts spending time on his own, learning actual skills, marketing, some light coding, basic finance beyond what is in the textbook. He is essentially running two educations in parallel. The official one he is paying for and the informal one he is teaching himself for free. He graduates. He has $89,000 in debt when you account for interest accrual during enrollment. He gets a job as a marketing coordinator at a mid-size company making $46,000 a year after taxes. That is about $32,000. His loan payments at standard repayment are around $940 a month. His rent is $1,100. Transportation, food, basic expenses bring him to roughly $3,600 in monthly fixed costs on a take-home of about $2,600 a month. He is underwater from day one. Not catastrophically, not in a way that creates immediate crisis. But he has no savings, no margin, no capacity to invest, no ability to take the kind of financial risk that builds actual wealth because his entire financial life is consumed by the cost of the credential he was told was an investment. Here is the cruel irony. The skills he actually uses in his job, the things that make him good at his work, are almost entirely things he taught himself. The degree got him past the applicant filter. The actual competence came from somewhere else. He paid $90,000 for a filter. Now imagine a parallel version of Marcus. Same intelligence, same drive, same starting point, but this version at 17 stumbles into a different information environment. He finds good content about digital skills, about building an audience, about how the software economy actually works. He spends a year building skills, starts freelancing at 19 while working a basic job to cover expenses, gets to $3,000 a month in freelance income by 20. Builds that into an agency or a product or a consulting practice by 22. By 25, he has no debt. He has skills the market actually wants. He has client relationships. He has a financial foundation and he has a 4-year head start on compounding any income into actual assets. The difference between these two Marcus scenarios is not intelligence. It is not work ethic. It is the information environment he encountered at 17 and which path felt legible and safe and available to him at the moment he was making the decision. Gen Z as a generation is increasingly living in the second information environment and the decision rates reflect that. Now let me introduce you to the mechanism that accelerated all of this because there is one specific thing that happened between 2020 and 2024 that I think served as the genuine breaking point. It was not a single event. It was a period of time in which several things became simultaneously visible that had previously been obscured. During the pandemic shutdown starting in 2020, universities moved online almost universally. Students who are paying full tuition for the in-person experience suddenly received a fully remote version of that experience while still paying the same price. The social dimension vanished. The campus access vanished. What remained was lectures, readings, assignments, and grades delivered through video calls. And students noticed something important. What remained, the pure learning content of the university experience, was not obviously better than what was available for free. In many cases, it was demonstrably worse because the professors had not been trained in online pedagogy, because the institutional structure was not designed for asynchronous learning, because the accountability mechanisms that made in-person classes functional did not translate cleanly to remote formats. Meanwhile, people were sitting at home with time and internet access. And a lot of them discovered that they could learn skills faster from free resources than from paid university courses. That realization, experienced personally by millions of people simultaneously, was not something you could argue away after the fact. The veil had been pulled back. The university experience has legitimate value. I want to be precise about this. The social infrastructure, the peer networks, the structured environment, the accountability of being in a physical place with other people who are doing similar things. These have real value, especially for certain types of learners and certain types of fields. That value is not $170,000 of value at a private university. The content itself is not competitive with what is freely available in most non-specialized fields. And the realization that those two things were true became impossible to unsee after 2020. Let me now give you the fourth layer. This is the one that I think is most structurally important and least discussed. There is a concept in economics called signaling theory. It was developed formally by an economist named Michael Spence in the 1970s. And the core idea is this. A college degree, even if it teaches you nothing directly applicable to your job, serves as a costly signal. It tells an employer, this person was capable and motivated enough to complete this difficult, expensive multi-year process. Even if the content is irrelevant, the completion itself signals qualities that are relevant. Persistence, baseline intelligence, ability to navigate institutional environments, that signal has value. The signal is part of what you are paying for when you pay for a degree. And for a long time, it was a hard signal to replicate cheaply. It was costly, which is exactly what made it credible as a signal. A cheap signal is easy to fake. An expensive signal is harder to fake. Here is the problem. The signal value of a college degree depends on the assumption that completing it is genuinely difficult and selective. As more people complete degrees and as degree completion rates are pushed upward by institutional pressure to retain students, the difficulty signal weakens. The credential inflates, you need more of it to signal the same thing. This is credential inflation, and it has been happening in slow motion for 30 years. What required a bachelor's degree in 2000 now requires a master's degree. What required a master's degree now requires specific certifications and demonstrated portfolio work on top of the degree. The signal keeps inflating because the credential keeps becoming more common. There is a breaking point in any signaling system where the cost of the signal exceeds the value of the information it conveys. At that point, rational actors stop using that signal and start looking for alternatives. That is exactly what is happening. Both employers and employees, both the buyers and the workers, are simultaneously searching for alternative signaling mechanisms that are lower cost and higher fidelity. The alternatives that are emerging are actually more interesting than most people give them credit for. Demonstrated portfolio work, certifications with actual skill assessments rather than time-based completion, work history with measurable outcomes, open source contributions, revenue from independent projects, audience size for content-based work. These are all forms of signaling that have a crucial advantage over the degree. They are directly tied to actual competence rather than credential completion. A GitHub profile full of real projects tells you something specific about a person's programming ability. A degree in computer science tells you they sat through classes in programming. These are not the same information. One requires you to have actually done the thing. One requires you to have been present while someone explained the thing. The shift from credential signaling to competence signaling is one of the most economically important transitions happening in the labor market right now, and it is being driven not by ideology but by the basic logic of signal efficiency. The conveyor belt's output, the stamped unpackaged credential, is a blunt signal, and increasingly the market is demanding sharper ones. Let me talk briefly about two things that often come up as objections here because I think both of them deserve honest treatment. The first objection is, what about the fields where the credential is genuinely necessary? Medicine, law, structural engineering, licensed trades that require formal certification. This is a completely valid point, and I am not making a universal argument. There are fields where institutional training is not just a credential game. It is a genuine competency requirement tied to safety and legal liability. A surgeon needs to have gone through medical school. A civil engineer designing a bridge needs to have been formally trained and licensed. But here is the thing. Those fields have always been a minority of total employment. The bulk of the labor market is not medicine and law and structural engineering. The bulk of the labor market is business operations, marketing, sales, technology, media, logistics, finance, management, and service industries. And in most of those fields, the formal credential is increasingly a convention rather than a genuine competency requirement. The objection applies to a real and important segment of the market, but it does not save the general model. The second objection is, what about the social and intellectual development the university provides? The argument that leaving your hometown, living with different people, engaging with ideas outside your immediate experience, being forced to read widely across disciplines. These things build a kind of broad human capability that cannot be replicated by online courses, and this is partially true, and I want to be honest about that, but it is doing a very specific kind of work in this debate. It is defending the experience of the university, not the economics of the university. You can believe that living away from home and engaging with diverse ideas is valuable and still believe that the current pricing model for that experience is financially destructive. Those are separate questions. The experience of intellectual and social expansion is real and important. The question is whether it needs to be packaged with $100,000 of non-dischargeable debt and a credential whose signaling value is in structural decline. Those things do not have to come together. The fact that they have been bundled together for decades does not mean they must be. Here is where we need to talk about what actually happens next. Because the question is not whether this transition is happening. It is. The question is what the new system looks like and whether it serves people better or just differently. The emerging alternative infrastructure has three main components. And I want to be precise about what each one does and does not solve. The first is skills-based learning. Free and paid online education platforms, boot camps, self-directed learning through documentation and community apprenticeship models, paid residency programs that tech companies are beginning to experiment with. These solve the competency development problem remarkably well for technical and analytical fields. They are faster, cheaper, more current, and often more applicable than their university equivalents. They are not perfect. The lack of structure, the absence of accountability, the difficulty of self-directed learning for people who have not yet developed that skill. These are real limitations, but the floor of what is achievable through self-directed learning has risen dramatically. The second component is alternative credentialing. This is the part that is least developed and most interesting. What replaces the degree as a signal when the degree stops being reliable? The answer seems to be a combination of things. Portfolio and project-based evidence, micro-credentials from industry-recognized bodies, demonstrated revenue and outcomes from independent work, performance-based hiring processes where you do a test or a trial project before getting an offer. These are all messier than a single credential, but they are higher fidelity. They actually tell you something about what a person can do rather than just where they sat for 4 years. The third component is network and community formation for alternative channels. This is the one that the university system genuinely does better than most alternatives right now. Alumni networks, peer cohorts, faculty mentorship, the social infrastructure of a well-resourced university is hard to replicate. But here is what is changing. Online communities organized around specific skills and industries are increasingly functional as professional networks. The Discord server for a serious technical community, the community around a high-quality educational platform, the peer cohort that forms around an intensive bootcamp or accelerator program. These are beginning to function as the network infrastructure that previously required institutional affiliation. Not perfectly, not yet. But a gap is closing faster than most people expected. Now, I want to give you the genuinely counterintuitive version of this. The one that I think most commentators miss when they cover this topic. The narrative about Gen Z leaving college is usually framed as disruption. Young people are disrupting education. Technology is disrupting education. This framing makes it sound like the disruption is coming from outside the system. But the more accurate framing is this. The system has been disrupting its own value proposition for 30 years through uncontrolled price increases, and the market is finally responding. The disruption is not something being done to the system. It is the natural market response to a product whose cost has grown at 3.5 times inflation for 4 decades without proportional improvement in outcomes. If a restaurant charges 4 times as much as it did 20 years ago and the food has not gotten better, the restaurant is going to lose customers. This is not disruption. This is basic economics. The university system has been increasing prices dramatically while the core value proposition of content delivery has been simultaneously commoditized by the internet, and the predictable result is now occurring. The universities that will survive this transition in strong form are the ones that have identified what they uniquely offer that cannot be commoditized. The research universities that are genuine generators of knowledge rather than just transmitters of it. The institutions with exceptional mind networks that are genuinely activated and career useful. The programs in fields where institutional training is legally or technically non-negotiable, those will be fine. The institutions in the middle, The thousands of regional universities and private colleges that are primarily in the business of processing students through and conferring credentials without distinctive research output or genuinely powerful networks. Those are in serious structural trouble, and the numbers support this. Over the last 5 years, more than 80 colleges in the United States have closed or merged. That number is not going down. The conveyor belt is not shutting down completely, but an increasing number of the machines in the middle of the factory floor are going offline. Let me do a brief interruption in this argument to say something that I think is important context. I am 20 years old. I did not go to college. I am not saying that because I think it makes me impressive or because I want you to make the same decision. I am saying it because my vantage point on this is specific and limited in particular ways. I can see the economic structure clearly. I can analyze the incentive dynamics. I have done well by opting out and building skills directly. But I also have a specific risk profile, a specific set of circumstances, a specific appetite for uncertainty, and a specific set of skills that happen to be highly monetizable in the current environment. None of those things are universal. What I can tell you is not college is bad. What I can tell you is that the automatic assumption that college is the safe choice is no longer accurate. Safety requires running the actual numbers, not accepting the cultural assumption. Now, here is the thing that I think represents the deepest and most important shift, and it is psychological, not economic. The generation currently making these decisions grew up watching the previous generation follow the rules perfectly and still lose. They watched people get degrees, get the corporate jobs, build careers at companies that laid off entire departments in 2008. In 2020. In 2023, they watch people in their 30s and 40s with good jobs and real credentials get financially erased by circumstances that had nothing to do with their credential or their effort. What that observation produces in a generation is a specific kind of skepticism about the relationship between rule following and outcomes. Not nihilism, not giving up, but a very clear-eyed recognition that playing the official game as designed does not guarantee security. And if it does not guarantee security, then the only logical reason to play it is if it also provides the best return. And the numbers increasingly say it does not. This is not Gen Z being entitled or resistant to hard work. The Gen Z people who are building things outside traditional employment structures are often working harder and more intensely than their peers in traditional tracks. But they have made a different calculation about where to direct that effort. They have decided that effort inside a system that cannot guarantee its outputs is less rational than effort directed at building something they can actually control. That is not laziness. That is systems thinking. That is what happens when you remove the emotional attachment to how things are supposed to work and just look at what actually produces results. The psychological shift is from institutional trust to evidence-based trust. Not I trust this because it is the established path, but I trust this because I can see specific evidence that it produces the outcomes I want. That shift is harder to reverse than a trend. A trend changes when the mood changes. A psychological framework changes only when the evidence consistently contradicts it. And right now the evidence is not contradicting it. Let me give you the practical synthesis because I do not like ending things with just analysis. There are 3 things I think are genuinely actionable from this, regardless of whether you have already gone to college, are deciding whether to go, or are somewhere in between. The first is this. Separate the 3 functions of education in your own thinking. Education is competency development. Education is credentialing and signaling. Education is network and social infrastructure. These 3 things have been bundled together for so long that most people think of them as one thing. They are not one thing. Different paths serve these 3 functions to different degrees. And the rational question is which combination of path serves all 3 of your needs at the lowest total cost: financial, temporal, and opportunity cost. For some people in some fields with some risk profiles, the traditional university path still provides the best combination. For an increasing number of people in an increasing number of fields, it does not. The point is to actually run the analysis rather than accept the cultural default. The second is about signaling strategy. If you are not going through the traditional credentialing system, you have to be more intentional about building alternative signals. The market is not yet fully adapted to non-credential hiring, which means you have to compensate with signal redundancy, portfolio work, demonstrable revenue, verified skills, professional reputation in your field, measurable outcomes. You cannot just say you can do something because without the credential, nobody has a shortcut for believing you. You have to provide the evidence directly. This is more work up front, but it is work that compounds in a way that credentials do not. The credential is static. A demonstrated track record grows. The third is about timing and leverage. The shift I described in this video is real, but it is not complete. There are still industries and hiring managers and companies that weight credentials heavily and have not updated their processes. If you are making decisions in the next 2 to 5 years, you are operating in a transition period where the old system is not fully broken down and the new one is not fully formed. The advantage goes to people who understand both, who can speak the language of the old system when it is required while building competence and reputation through the mechanisms that will increasingly matter in the new one. The belt is still running. It is just running slower, producing less reliable outputs and costing more to ride than the toll collectors are willing to admit. The question is not whether to demolish it. The question is whether your specific situation, your field, your risk profile, your alternatives makes the toll worth paying or not. That is a calculation only you can run. But at least now you have more of the variables. If anything in this video made you think differently about how educational systems actually function and who they are actually designed to serve, that is the kind of content I make. Subscribe if you want to stay in the loop. And one final thing, the next generation of people who build serious wealth will not be the ones who found the best shortcut or the best hack or the best system someone else designed. It will be the ones who understood the systems well enough to know when to use them and when to build outside them. That distinction between being a participant in a system and being someone who understands the system from the outside is the most valuable thing you can develop. It is not a credential. Nobody gives it to you, and that is exactly why it is worth